You know, for the longest time, if you were a hybrid shooter and you wanted the best of both worlds, a camera that could do really good video, that had 4K, that had maybe slightly higher frame rates than the standard 24, and you also wanted to be able to take really good photos with one camera body, you were basically relegated to expensive full-frame options. However, as cameras have gotten better and better, more and more compelling options have popped up for hybrid shooters that really don't break the bank. And this right here, the Sony A6700, is probably the best hybrid shooter camera I have seen ever. It's so good at both photo and video, it's almost too much, almost a little overkill. First, let's talk some specs. It is a 26 megapixel backside illuminated APS-C sensor with 5-axis in-body image stabilization. Sony claims the image stabilization is good for about 5 stops of vibration reduction. When shooting video, it can do 4K up to 120 frames per second with a 1.58 times crop. When you're shooting a 4K frame rate of 60 frames per second or less, it will actually oversample the 4K from a 6K image and take the image from the full sensor. With a fast enough memory card, this camera will also do 422 10-bit internally. In continuous photo shooting, it can do up to 11 frames per second using 759 autofocus points. This represents about 93% coverage over the entire sensor. Whenever I'm doing camera reviews like this on this channel, I rarely talk about things like the image processor, mainly because at any given point in time, any camera that's released is claimed to have the latest and greatest image processor, right? Every single time Sony or Fuji or Nikon release a new camera, they're always going to claim it's the best that they've ever done, which makes a lot of sense. However, I do think the image processor and the chip inside this camera is worth mentioning, because it's not just one chip, it's actually 2. One of the biggest marketing pushes for this camera when it was released was that second chip. Sony claims it is a dedicated autofocus chip that uses artificial intelligence to give you better and faster subject recognition and tracking. And while there's certainly a lot to talk about with the specs of this camera, especially when it comes to video capabilities, I think the autofocus is the more interesting talking point. So let's talk about that. If you've ever used a Sony camera, especially one released in the past 5-6 years, you know that the autofocus is phenomenal. It's the primary reason why they're some of the most popular cameras amongst professionals. It's the reason why I use a Sony for every single wedding that I shoot. And so it's no surprise that Sony's current flagship crop sensor camera has incredible autofocus. But the real question that I have about the A6700's autofocus is just how good is it, and how much difference does that AI chip make in the autofocus performance? Sony's autofocus is phenomenally good at finding focus on human subjects, especially locking onto human eyes. And this camera is no different. It's incredibly fast, it's incredibly accurate. In fact, I would say it's more accurate and faster at autofocus than my A7 IV that I currently shoot on. Now, one of Sony's big claims is that due to the addition of this AI chip, it can recognize and lock onto a wider range of subjects. You are not only limited to humans and animals or birds, you can also recognize things like vehicles and trains and planes and a few others. So to test this, I brought it to the Denver Zoo. While I was there, I made a point of switching between shooting animal subjects and human subjects, and more importantly, a different variety of animal subjects, not just birds or lizards or anything like that, but a wide variety of different animals. Mainly because in the autofocus modes, you can switch between human and face tracking, you can switch between general animal tracking as well as birds specifically. So I wanted to see how well it could differentiate between those 3 different types of subjects. In each of the subject recognition modes, when you were shooting that specific subject, it was incredibly good at finding focus and, when available, locking onto that subject's eyes, as long as you were close enough. However, one thing I did notice was that when you're switching between the three different types of subjects, if you're shooting people, for example, and you have the setting set to human face recognition, and you suddenly switch over to shooting a penguin, it actually has a rather difficult time locking onto the eyes. In fact, it won't even try. Occasionally, it will recognize the subject as you switch between them, but it's not very good at taking itself out of the pre-prescribed mode and switching to a different one. There aren't too many real-world situations where you have to constantly go back between humans and animals and cars and planes. But if you are someone that, let's say, photographs automotive events, and you sometimes need to photograph people and you sometimes need to photograph cars, if you leave it on vehicle recognition, it may have a harder time finding faces and locking onto eyes. In the real world, though, how much does that really matter? How often are you going to find yourself outside of the zoo shooting between humans and animals and cars over and over again? Probably not too often. And that's not to say that it cannot find focus if you leave it on a certain focus mode. If you leave it in animal focus, it will still focus on someone's face and it will still focus on a person. It's just not quite as good at it because it's still trying to find a bird or something else to lock onto. But by no means does that mean it's not going to be in focus. The most impressive thing about the A6700's autofocus capabilities is its ability to find autofocus in low light. It's the thing that sets it apart from slightly older Sony autofocus systems, even on my A7 IV. Recently, I took both of these cameras to a wedding, and I used the A6700 as my B camera. However, when the lights turned off and people hit the dance floor, the A6700 became my primary camera, and realistically, the only camera that was capable of finding focus in those dark conditions. My A7 IV constantly missed focus and had a really hard time finding subjects to focus on when the situation got a little darker. Sony's claim about the A6700's low light autofocus is that it will be able to find focus even if you're shooting at -3 EV. And based on my experience, I believe them. In addition to the impressive low-light autofocus finding performance, the tracking performance in photo is also incredibly impressive. It's even more impressive when you start to shoot video and you can see that little green square tracking and following along the eye perfectly of any subject you are shooting. So all that to say, the A6700 has incredible autofocus. But how much of that is down to the AI chip and how much of that is simply improved algorithm from Sony? Now, realistically, I don't have the capability or technical know-how to really test that and to get a definitive answer. But I suspect it is more down to the fact that it just has a faster algorithm, as well as the fact that it has two processors now, one processor solely dedicated to autofocus. Simply put, this camera has one computer to handle all of its basic functions and one separate computer specifically to do autofocus. And just by taking that workload off of the primary processor and having a separate thing dedicated to one single task is going to make it fast. But what really sells my opinion on it is the fact that when I was shooting at the zoo, I couldn't switch between a human and an animal subject. You would think that something that is truly artificial intelligence would be able to tell the difference between a penguin and a person. In this camera though, you really have to switch between the modes in order to tell it to do that. And to me, that doesn't feel particularly intelligent. Okay, so maybe calling it AI autofocus is a little bit gimmicky and more of a marketing ploy than true artificial intelligence, but the autofocus is still phenomenal. Let's talk about the image quality now. The image quality is what you would expect out of a Sony. 26 megapixels offers you slightly more resolution than its predecessor to crop in and to reframe your photos in post. However, as long as you pair it with the right lens, it's gonna come out nice and sharp with a lot of detail to work with. One thing that I've always noticed about Sony cameras is that their colors tended to have a slightly cooler magenta shift. Their older cameras, like my old A7R II, had this to an almost extreme degree. Now, they've done a great job of improving their color science and improving the natural look of their colors, but they still show up a little bit on the cool side. So just know that if you get this camera and you're taking photos with it, you are gonna have to maybe bump up the warmth just a little bit or try to compensate in camera by setting your white balance accordingly. If you're a landscape photographer, you are gonna find the compactness of this camera pretty darn good, but you may find that it's rather lacking in terms of resolution. If you're a sports or action photographer, you are going to find the AF tracking performance incredibly useful on this camera, but 11 frames per second may not be quite good enough for you. If you're a wedding or a portrait photographer, you are going to love the autofocus performance and you're gonna love the overall usability of this camera and ability to switch between high-speed video and awesome photo shooting. But you're gonna find that the lack of a dual SD card slot is going to be a bit of a deal breaker for you. If you're purely a video shooter, you are going to find the 422 10-bit internal awesome. You're gonna find the ability to shoot 4K 120 incredibly useful when you want slow motion, and you're gonna find that the I/O and the connectivity of this camera is very useful for attaching all of your monitors and accessories. But you may find that having to crop for 4K 120 can be a bit of a deal breaker for you because you're not going to be able to achieve wide framing that you want. So basically all that to say, if you are some kind of a specialist, if you do one thing in particular, you are going to have to make sacrifices if you wind up buying this camera. It's not the perfect camera for any one type of shooting. It is the perfect camera for someone that does a little bit of everything. You've probably heard the phrase, a jack of all trades is a master of none. And it's often used in a negative connotation for people that kind of have popcorn brain, that do too many things and aren't very good at one particular thing. But you may not have heard the full phrase, which goes, a jack of all trades is a master of none, but better than a master of one. And the A6700 is a true jack of all trades. So the final question is the A6700 worth it? And to do that, we have to talk about what other cameras you can get at around the $1,400 range that can do what the A6700 can. In the world of full frame cameras, you have the Canon R6 or the Nikon Z7 II. Those are probably the closest in price and are pretty similar in terms of photo performance, but fall quite a bit short in the video capabilities, especially the Nikon. And while the Canon is known for having excellent autofocus performance, probably on par with most of the Sony flagships, the Nikon really falls short in that area as well, at least from what I've heard. In terms of similar video specifications, you have the Sony FX30, you have the Canon C7, and you of course have the A7S III. All of those options though are quite a bit more expensive than the $1,400 MSRP of the 6700. So it's in competition with some pretty major players, but it comes in at a fraction of the price. The real question isn't, is this a good camera? Because it is phenomenal. It will do everything that you need it to and more, especially if you are a hybrid shooter. The real question to determine if it's worth it is, do you need the specific features for one specific niche? If that's the case, you are probably better off with something different. But if you're someone that does a little bit of everything or wants the option to do a little bit of everything, the A6700 is going to give that to you. So all that to say, the A6700 offers incredible value for hobbyists and professionals alike. But more than that, this feels like the perfect gateway drug into the Sony ecosystem. You get to experience all of the value and everything that Sony offers, and I think this camera is going to make a lot of people jump ship from their current systems over to a Sony system. As a matter of fact, it was a Sony A6400 that brought me over from Nikon, and I haven't left for nearly a decade. All right guys, that's pretty much it. Those are my thoughts on the A6700. If you have shot with this camera or have this camera, I'd love to know what your experience has been in the comments down below. And more specifically, what are your thoughts on the autofocus? Is it truly artificial intelligence, or is it more of a marketing ploy? Let me know in the comments. If you guys found this video helpful and if you enjoyed it, please hit that like button. If you want to see more photography related content like this, please hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next one.